Now I'd like to have you all meet our distinguished guest for this evening, Cary Willson, the MGM screen commentator whose trademark is...
What do you think?
What are you going to tell us tonight, Cary?
A fable entitled 3 Days in the Life of the World's Worst Worrier. Now, a worrier is, according to my dictionary, one who worries. This is a story of a worrier whom we shall call John Jones because that is not his name. John Jones is not of the common or garden variety of worriers. No, John is a real worrier. Well do I remember the occasion when John Jones, at a social gathering, encountered a feminine kindred spirit. Yes, she murmured sympathetically, "Indeed, I do understand, Mr. Jones. Would you believe it? I can worry myself sick over the tiniest trifles." John Jones arose in righteous indignation. "You call yourself a worrier," he demanded. "Why, I can worry myself sick over absolutely nothing at all." Our story of John Jones begins on a Sunday evening when he has to dinner at his home a lovely lady. During coffee, the telephone rang. It was John Jones' movie producer boss at the studio, who desired John Jones to go to work even at that hour of the Sabbath in order to deliver on the following morning a story which John Jones has said was wandering around vaguely in his brain. The lovely lady, anxious to be cooperative, would not even permit the courtesy of John Jones' escort to her home. She thrust John Jones into his study, closed the door, and summoned a taxicab by telephone. Some minutes later, John Jones was torn from his typewriter by the sound of the lady's scream. He rushed into the living room. "Look," the lady cried. "Burglars, bandits." John peered out the round porthole in the closed front door. At the curb was a blue coupe. In its open door was a man with a saturnine face. Clasped in his right hand was a pistol that looked 7 feet long. Then John Jones heard a small voice. He lowered his eyes. On the doorstep, not reaching up to the level of the porthole, was a small female figure. She wore no hat. She had a tousled mop of brown hair. That was all he could see. But at that instant, it only took an instant, the female dwarf or gnome turned and ran. In another instant, the coupe door slammed and the vehicle disappeared around the corner. No work for John Jones that night. But John Jones did not report the matter to the police. He settled himself down to worry about it. Arriving at the studio next morning, John Jones was informed by his secretary that 2 men had called to see him. They could return because, in their own words, they were very anxious indeed to have a chat with John Jones. Instantly, John's worries were doubled. "Didn't they give any clue to their identity?" he insisted. "Yes," said the secretary. "They said they were G-men from Washington." Now John Jones could indulge in some real worrying. He drove home on 2 wheels, hurtled his car into the garage, ran into the house, locked the doors and windows, and turned to find a note on the table. It was from his servant. It read, "Mr. Jones, there was a policeman here to see you today. He said he'd be back." So John worried himself through a second sleepless night. And next day at the studio, there was vague, unexpressed opinion that John Jones was starting to crack. Complaining of a headache, John fled home in the safety of the noonday sun. He couldn't eat, he couldn't read, he couldn't think, but he could worry. In mid-afternoon, John sneaked out the door to grab the evening paper from the lawn where the newsboy daily tossed it. But even as John stooped to pick it up, he saw the coupe approaching. It swerved in toward the curb. Then, as if suddenly cautious, it picked up speed and dashed out of sight. John rushed into the house and went to bed, a sick man. A really sick man. For doctors will tell you that worry is a tangible poison. He didn't tell his doctor what was the matter. Worriers just don't do that. At breakfast on the 3rd day, John ransacked his mind. Although his conscience was clear, he managed without much difficulty to convince himself that the local police had reason to hurl him into the hoosgow, that the government in Washington could invite him to Alcatraz for criminal income tax evasion, and that the blue coupe housed someone sworn by a blood feud to pursue a vendetta with John Jones until his death wiped it out. And then he saw a policeman coming up the front walk. Determined to face the worst, John Jones went to the door. "Mr. John Jones?" asked the officer. "Yes," said John hoarsely. The policeman smiled. "Mr. Jones, I'm a great admirer of your work on the screen. I'm taking a night course in journalism at the university, and I wonder if you'd go over the thesis I'm preparing and give me some healthy criticism." If you think John Jones stopped worrying, then you don't know what a real worrier is. No, the vendetta and the G-men still remain. In mid-afternoon came another bombshell, a telegram. John's nervous fingers ripped it open. "From Washington? That's bad." But the signature was that of an old friend, and the message: "Gave 2 pals of mine a letter of introduction. Please be nice as they're swell guys. They tried to see you Monday but couldn't and went to San Francisco. They'll look you up again next week. Incidentally, they're G-men." John Jones sat down weakly in a chair. But wait, there's still the vendetta. And at that precise minute, the blue coupe pulled up to the curb. John could stand the suspense no longer. He rushed out of the house and up to the Saturnine gentleman, now revealed to be a quite harmless individual, who smiled, said, "You've got quite a lot of mail this afternoon," and handed him a dozen letters. It was the postman. It was all soon explained. Sunday night, the postman had an unlocated special delivery and thought John Jones might know of a stranger visiting in the neighborhood. But when the lady answered the door, the courteous postman had decided not to interrupt if John Jones was entertaining. The little female gnome, the postman's daughter. She was a movie fan, and she'd wanted to meet John Jones to ask him if he could possibly get her an autograph of Norma Shearer. So John Jones was finally convinced that all the mad and mysterious menaces were trivial incidents, until he worried them into horrific dangers. He wouldn't believe that one of the most important philosophies of life is the fact that nothing ever turns out to be quite so bad as it threatens, which has been stated beautifully by a famous man who said that the greatest tragedies of his life were the ones that didn't happen. Of course, on the other hand, nothing ever turns out quite so well as it promises. But the average human being is prepared for this by the knowledge that this is earth, not heaven, and so he acquires a certain skepticism of all promised glory. The following morning, John Jones arose from 10 hours' luscious sleep, halfway to the studio, reveling now in the sunshine, the flowers, and the bright blue sky. Suddenly, John Jones was overcome with a surge of worry. He stopped the car by the side of the road. He clenched his fists. He gritted his teeth. But strange, he couldn't place the exact frightful thing he was worrying about. And then he realized he was worried sick because he had nothing to worry about. Now, as I said, this is a fable, and a fable should have a moral, which is an admonition for those who read or hear to take heed and learn a lesson. I don't think any moral is needed here, for I'm sure neither you nor I could ever possibly worry the way John Jones does. I ought to tell you John Jones' real name. His real name is Cary Willson.